welcome back to the channel. In today's video I'm going to be discussing my top 10 books that I read in 2021 and also some of the honorable mentions that I would just like to mention. 4 or 5 stars and have stayed with me till the end of the year, and I'm just going to take you by one from the start to the finish. Okay, without any further ado, let's get started. The first book that I read this year was actually 100 Nights of Hero by Isabel Greenberg. If you haven't already read Isabel Greenberg's work, I would highly recommend it. She's a phenomenal artist. She's so talented. She really just brings out the characters on the page to life. And before I move any further and tell you what the book is about, it's actually a graphic novel. So if you haven't already read previous works of Isabel Greenberg, I would suggest that you start from there and then you make your way up till 100 Nights of Hero. So essentially what 100 Nights of Hero is about is that it's loosely based on the Arabian Nights. And when I say loosely, I mean that it borrows a lot of heavy concepts. So there is a king in this one as well who decides to marry different brides every day and stay married to them throughout the night, and then in the morning he decides to basically a mix of Arabian Nights and also another book called A Hero's Journey, which was written by Joseph Campbell, if I'm not wrong, and it clashes both of them together and kind of gives you this really great narrative which you can follow through. So there are 2 princesses. I think one is a princess, one is a chambermaid, and they're in love. And so the princess decides to save her kingdom, to marry this evil king and to just get rid of him for once and for all. Isabel Greenberg takes you on this wild ride of fantasy worlds and these wonderful places that you never want to come back from. So I would suggest that if you read even one book from this whole 10 books that I'm recommending, it should definitely be Isabel Greenberg's 100 Nights of Hero. So the next book on the list is In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. This is kind of like a memoir written around the author's relationship with another woman, where it was very abusive, physically, emotionally, as well as sexually. But the way that it's written is so creative that she divides each chapter into different genres. So it would be Dream House as a romance or Dream House as a mystery thriller, and then she's just kind of explaining her relationship with this woman. And when you read it, it's just so creative because you kind of keep going back to the chapters. For instance, for me, when I read Dream House as a romance, where she's initially introducing their meet cute, it really seems like a meet cute, this author meeting another woman that she's potentially going to have a relationship with. And then what ends up happening in Dream House as a thriller, or I think Dream House as a novel chapter, is that you realize that all those things that you read in the chapter about romance or the meet cute were actually red flags about their relationships. And because she was looking at the world with rose tinted glasses, she couldn't really realize what kind of woman she was going to be in a relationship with. And just that kind of sudden realization hits you mid chapter, and every chapter it's like that. You keep going back to the previous genres and keep reading if there are any clues or anything else that help you in the later chapters. And there's this kind of back and forth going on in the book constantly that helps you be on your toes, but also helps you kind of makes you want to know more about the relationship and what kind of trauma that she went through. I think it's a very powerful way of writing, and I would highly recommend this one. The next book is a pretty well-known one, so I'm not going to be discussing too much about it. It is A Court of Silver Flames. This is the 4th book in the A Court of Thorn and Roses series. This is a YA fantasy series initially, but now it's become into an adult fantasy. If you've already read A Court of Thorn and Roses, I don't want to speak too much about it. There's lots of things out there about it already, so I'll just keep this short. This one stayed with me particularly because Nesta was such a complex character in the other 3 books, and just getting to know her and be inside her head and really know the guilt that she feels and the emotional turmoil that's within her when she's dealing with the death of her father and this estrangement with her sisters. It really impacts her more and makes her really fleshed out. So that's why I really enjoyed this one, even though the fantasy side of it was a little bit lukewarm, but I would really recommend it for the character study of Nesta. And if you really enjoy A Court of Thorn and Roses, then I guess there's no other reason for you to read it except for the fact that it's written by Sarah J. Maas. So yeah. The next one that I want to talk about is Riders and Lovers by Lily King. I really enjoyed this novel so much. I think there is something really great in the way that Lily King has written her character. In this one, we follow the main protagonist, who's a 30-something girl, and she's, you know, just trying to make ends meet. So she is creative and she wants to publish something, and she has this idea for a great novel, but her reality is so different. Like, she's a waitress, she's constantly harassed by her employees, except for like one particular employee who's her great friend, and she has to take on this job of a waitress just because she wants to make ends meet. She's in lots of student loans and student debts, and she lives in this kind of a garage shack type place, which is really like, which is not livable at all, but she has made it into her own room. And as we keep following her, like at the beginning of the novel, as we when we're introduced to her, you really feel sad for her. She's just recently lost her mother, and she has this very complicated relationship with her siblings, and she's trying to write something and she's trying to make something out of herself, but she feels that her day job is just kind of killing her creativity. And what I really like about the novel is that it's so real. Like, the direction that King takes is very realistic, because when we're introduced to her, she's very much like down in the dregs, but when we meet her at the end, she still has her loans, and she still has her issues, and she's still dealing with the trauma of losing her mother, and she still has the question of, you know, what it means to be an artist, because she has all of these artist friends who talk at length about what art is, what abstract art is, what writing is, and so on and so forth, while she is not that critical and she's not that intellectual. So she always thinks that she's you know, lacking as a writer, and she has these identity issues as well. Why, like, am I really a writer? Am I not really a writer? Like, what am I really? While she's trying to juggle with all of these different things that's happening in her life. So when you meet her, there's so much that can be improved in her as a character. But when you end the novel, there's so much that has improved, but there's lots of things that are still unresolved, and that there's a hope that they might be resolved in the future, but you don't really know, because that's where the novel ends. And just the realism of it really impacted me, because one of the ones that I would highly recommend if you haven't already checked it out. So this one is Think Again, The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know, and I would highly recommend it if you're looking for a good self-help novel, fiction novel. And this is one of the first ones that I've read by Adam Grant. Actually have seen his tweets on and off, but I've never actually, you know, read most of his books. So this was my first time reading his book. And so just the review that I wrote was, so this book essentially is about rethinking, not just about our core values, but also about our actions and our thoughts. And rethinking is a very powerful tool that almost everyone can, you know, consider in their life, because it creates this kind of constructive conversations that you can have with your friends, even though you might think that the areas that or the topics that you're discussing are very dangerous. For instance, some of the things that he talks about is stereotypes and political polarization and climate change and so on and so forth. So he's talking a lot about all of those, and how we can rework the way that we approach these topics just by rethinking our concepts and being open to understanding what the other person is saying. The very good thing about the way Grant writes is that he gives you lots of data, and he gives you lots of psychological studies that have already been done, but that can be a little bit heavy sometimes. So he pairs them really nicely with these you know, real events and these real stories that he's heard. And so when you read that story and then you apply the studies and the data, it just makes it so much more easier to understand. So the next one is Survive the Night by Riley Sager. Again, I don't want to say much about it because it's a mystery thriller, and this was the time when I was actually trying to make the switch into mystery thriller, because there's only so much YA and so much contemporary that I could read, and I really enjoyed it. It kind of follows this, you know, hidden identity. Is he a serial killer, or who is he kind of a vibe? It's set in the 1990s, and it follows our main character who is trying to go back home after the death of her best friend. And she's, you know, she doesn't feel very safe in the campus, so she decides to take a whole like year off and go back to her home and kind of focus on herself and focus on healing. So she puts up this ad for trying to, she puts up this ad where she asks if anyone wants to carpool, and this guy, he says that he wants to carpool, but she doesn't really know the guy, but she also is, financially her options are limited, so she ends up deciding to go with the guy anyway. And then while they are on the road and as they start talking, there's a lot of things that don't add up. So he tells his date wrong, or he tells his name wrong, and she finds evidence like driver's license in which there's a completely different name, or some of his stories don't match. And so slowly by slowly she starts to realize, and as she is filled with dread, so are we, because we realize that she might actually be on the road with a serial killer. And there are lots of twists and lots of turns in typical Ladi Sager fashion, and I was up all night reading. But I would highly recommend this for a good mystery thriller if you're looking for one. I know it's like more Christmassy season, but maybe around January, February, if you feel like reading a mystery, you always have an option with Survive the Night. Okay, so the next book that I read was Maidens. This one is by Alex. I'm not going to even try to pronounce his last name. This and The Silent Patient, both of them are by the same author. I sat on this for a while because I did enjoy The Silent Patient more, but I enjoyed the twist of The Maidens a little bit more. So I'm just going to talk about The Maidens, but I would also highly recommend The Silent Patient because it was very good, and it was very well written as well. So Maidens is essentially about a woman, Maria or Mariana, something like that. I'm just going to call her Maria, and she has just lost her husband. Like, oh my god, loss of a damn loved one is such like a just like a underlying layer for all of these stories. But so in this one, she has just lost her husband, and she gets a call from her niece in the middle of the night saying that one of her best friends has died. So the niece's name is Zoe, and so Zoe calls Maria saying that there's been a death on campus, there's been a murder on campus, and my best friend has died. So Maria, who's already dealing with grief, she understands that this is such a big thing for Zoe, so she leaves everything and she goes to Zoe's university to stay with her. And as she kind of digs around to know a little bit more about the murder, she ends up coming across this professor who's kind of revered amongst undergrad students, and he has a select group of girls who are very close to him, and kind of he gives them private tuitions and so on and so forth, and those girls are called the maidens. And things start looking really bleak, and she kind of starts understanding that there are bigger powers at play here, and this might actually not be a suicide/murder, this might actually be kind of a ritualistic cult-like event. So the more she digs deep into this, the more she realizes there's so many things that are happening. And as we keep following along, yes, it becomes very boring because it's written in a little bit of a boring way, and it kind of drags at points. But I felt like the twist was so satisfying, not just because I didn't see it coming, but also because I was really shocked. I was just not expecting the novel to go in that direction, and when it did go in that direction, I was like so excited to read more. Next book is again kind of like a self-help, self-reflective book on the list, and that one is called Trick Mirror. It's by Gia Tolentino. Is that how you say her name? Gia Tolentino? Gia is already, I think, a very famous blogger, and she's written a lot. She writes for a very famous newspaper as well. I don't know, is it a New Yorker? I'm not 100% sure, but she does write for one of the newspapers. And I have never read her work before. This was my first time reading any of her work, so it was fairly new to me. But a lot of criticism that she got in the book was that she's recycling her old arguments. I didn't see that because, of course, this was my first time reading. So I enjoyed most of the essays. There are like 8 self-reflexive essays in which she chooses these different topics like marriage or commitment, body issues. She even talks about reality TV and so on and so forth. And she makes very, strong arguments around these reflections. Only criticism that I have for her is that some of her essays was just like too muddled. She was trying to make a case for everything, and that came out a little bit, that came out a little bit weird because I wanted her to stick to one argument instead of making a case for everything. And she does that in 2 essays in particular, but more or less I enjoyed this very much. I read it on audiobook actually, and I would highly recommend, like, if you're looking for a great book to pass your time with and it has to be critical and self-reflexive, then I would highly recommend this one. For the last 2 books, and I'm a little tired because I've been speaking for so long, so I'm going to make this a little bit rushed, and I will be putting the honorary mentions in the box down below so that you guys can read it. And the next one is She Who Became the Sun. This one is an adult fantasy. I think this one was, one of the best books that I've read this whole year, just because it follows so many diverse characters, and there's so much diversity. Not just diversity, there's so much political intrigue, and there's so many interesting things happening within the novel that always keep you on your toes and make you feel like, okay, I want to know what's next, what is coming. It's a complete rags to riches stories, but it also has a little bit of a twist, which I'm again not going to talk about. You should read it, you should experience it for your own self. How it starts is there's this girl, and when we start the novel, she's around 6 or 7 years, so she's very young, and she lives with her father and her brother. Not named, there's no name that is given to her, so she's essentially nameless, and they keep calling her, even her father and her brother, they keep calling her the girl or the girl again and again, so there's no name that is associated with her. And she has been told since birth that her future is dark, like there is nothing in her future. She's not going to become and the village is very poor, it's drought-ridden, so there's no water, there's no food, and people have died or have left the village. So she's kind of like a scavenger. She's eating everything that she can find, because if her father and her brother, they do find something, they just consume it for their own self. So one day her house is raided by these kind of goons, and they end up killing her father. And her brother, who was supposed to be this great shining superior emperor or had some really great future when he was born, he's so overcome with grief that he also kills himself, because he cannot live with the fact that his father is dead. So what she does is that, because she doesn't want to end up in darkness, she ends up taking her brother's identity, and that's pretty much what her origin story is. And from there we kind of follow her. She goes to a monastery to become a monk, and then somehow she ends up in this political intrigue, and she does lots of different things in her life, but deep down only she knows what her truth is, which is that she is a woman. So I would highly recommend this one if you're looking for an adult fantasy. The last book that I read that impacted me deeply, of course there are multiple books, but this one was such a surprise, and it is called The Great Mistake, and this is by Jonathan Lee, if I'm not wrong. Yes, it is by Jonathan Lee, and it's called The Great Mistake. So when I picked it up, I actually thought that this was a mystery, but it's not. It's actually kind of historical, again more fictional than fact, but it follows this true historical figure called Andrew Haswell Green, and it follows the events leading up to his murder and what happened. It really is just like it's a very short novel. It's I think 200 pages or so, but it really just follows Andrew Haswell Green in his lifetime, and what sacrifices he made to get where he was. Actual historical figure that I didn't know about, and there's so much written on him already. And as we keep following him, it's more like a character portrait. He's written more in terms of a character portrait, but the whole thing is so compact and so tightly put together that it just really makes you feel sympathy for Andrew Haswell Green. And then there are two timelines. One is, of course, you're following Andrew Haswell Green leading up to his death, and the second timeline is after he died, and the kind of investigation that happens, and how the police ruled out what it was and what the intention of the murder was, and so on and so forth. So it's very interesting to read both the sides, and the narrator describes how he could not really make any real friendships, even though he was so lonely and he genuinely wanted to, just because he was always doing the next best thing or trying to make his mark on history, and just all of those little things written in sentences really impact you. So if you feel like reading a historical fiction about a real person, but also like to read character studies, I would definitely urge you to pick this one up because it's great. That is the end of this video. I know it went on for a very long time, but I hope that you enjoyed the 10 recommendations that I gave. You should make a point to read almost all of them, but if not, at least pick one from each genre and let me know if you enjoyed them. Okay, and I will see you in another video. Bye!